Hi guys, welcome to Love and Lust audiobooks channel, updated daily with great audiobooks, so please subscribe to me if you don't want to miss it. Well, let's go to read this book, Seducing My Older Alpha Mate, chapter 16 to 25, Sleeping Out. Simon's Paul. Lucky for him, I am such a vicious woman that I don't give up easily. Alice's eyes burned, telling me that she was serious. I already get too few things, so if it was me, I definitely would not give up. I will stop at nothing to snatch up what I like. My heart seemed to skip a beat. I stared at her, impressed by what she had said. It hurt to think about the fact that she didn't get much of what she desired, but the fact that she fought so hard for what she didn't want was admirable. I found myself wishing that I had that determination, that fire that burned into her life. I used to have such strong emotions as well, but they had ebbed out slowly over time. I could use that fire in my life. Laying on this beautiful mountain clearing was very relaxing, and I soon found myself opening up to her as we continued to talk. The more I talked to her, the more I began to understand her, and I found myself almost feeling guilty for bringing her out here because it was all going according to plan. And that's what was beginning to worry me. Flashback. I looked around my desk, waiting for Sophia to portal in. She had sent a message earlier to plan the meeting this time, so no surprises. With a quick glance at the clock, I relaxed. I still had a little over an hour before Alice would be here for her training.
"Hello, Simon," Sophia said from behind me.
I jumped at the voice and then collected myself. "Hello, Sophia," I answered. When I saw her, I couldn't help but smile. She was the one piece of home that I still had, and I instantly relaxed. She raised an eyebrow at catching me off guard and then returned my smile. "I'll get straight to business this time," she stated. "I have been looking into this Alice girl that you seem to be getting attached to," and I felt my heart tighten. "There's definitely a connection between her and the mutated rogues," Sophia began. "I asked around and some humans told me of a lab outside of the pack. Apparently, this lab has been searching for a girl that was taken away from them and into the palace. They have been trying to find a way to get to her for years. There is something special about her." I nodded my head at her words. Nothing she told me came as a surprise, but I still didn't want to necessarily hear it. It was hard to be getting attached to someone when I didn't fully know their history. I like to be prepared. "Anything else?" I asked. "Not yet. I need to find the actual location of the lab, and then I could get much more information." "Sophia, explain." I nodded. I needed to think of a way to get more information from the humans or find the lab, but I also needed to figure out the Alpha King's involvement. Why did he have a daughter associated with the mutated rogue? "What are you thinking?" Sophia asked, breaking my concentration. I sighed. I need to understand this pack's involvement with the mutated rogues if we are ever going to be able to destroy them for good. "You could bring Alice out of the pack to test the reaction of the people in the laboratory. Perhaps they could lead us straight to it," Sophia suggested, "as well as see how the wolves react in turn. That means Alice would essentially be bait." She looked at me suspiciously as if she were gauging my reaction to her statement. Honestly, at the word baits, I felt a little guilty. I didn't want to think of myself as using Alice in any way. However, I had already prodded enough to know that she had no clue about her past either. If I didn't do this, we may never find answer. "You aren't getting soft on me, are you, Simon?" Sophia asked in amazement. "I remember when you would use people for fun." "That's not me anymore," I said coolly. "You know, that was just the influence of my uncle, and he no longer holds any power over me." "Very well," Sophia noted. Despite her neutral tone, she looked happy. She created a portal merely with her hands and looked back at me. "Fill me in on how it goes tonight." I groaned as she disappeared.
Sophia still knew me well enough to know that I would have to do what needed to be done. I justified the plan by thinking that she would be happy to just get out of the palace. It wasn't a lie, tonight was the best time to do so. The only thing left to figure out was how.
Flashback in. I watched as Alice started to fall asleep beside me. She rolled closer to me, and my breath caught, but she was fast asleep. I stared at her beautiful face as she slept when she was sleeping. You could almost believe that she was as frail and fragile as the act she put on. I couldn't look away. What had she thought of my past? Had it changed how she thought of me? For someone who was usually so good at picking up things, I still couldn't quite tell if she liked me or not. And for some reason, that drove me crazy. There was a sound of footsteps nearby, making me sit up at alert immediately. I had sensed some humans following us as soon as we had neared the mountain, and it appeared they had finally caught up. I stood up. They would be no problem for me. I snuck away from Alice as quietly and carefully as possible. Approaching from behind the humans, I easily got rid of them. It was one thing to trick them, but that was too close. If she woke and saw them, we'd be in serious trouble. Once that was done, I walked up the mountain a little ways to get a better vantage point. That way I could watch over Alice in the clearing, and I could see the palace entrance. Even from this far away, I could see a large group gathering near the palace in the dark. It was hard to tell, but it had to be more humans. Satisfied that they had fallen for the trap, I made my way back down to Alice. I had called Elwin to help with the plan tonight as well. So at this very moment, he would be tracking the humans' whereabouts. The idea of people searching for Alice put me on edge, and I quickened my pace in a matter of seconds. I found myself back in the clearing and sighed in relief to see Alice still sleeping in the same spot. As I got closer to her, I realized she was curled into a ball and shivering slightly from the chilled night. The air on the mountain was a little cooler than below. Without thinking, I shifted back into a wolf and laid down next to her, pressing my warm fur against her. She mumbled in response and shimmied closer, making my insides burn, and a soft growl of pleasure rolled out. I meant to just warm her up, but I was feeling warmer too. I was just laying my head down in content when I felt a breeze of wind and snapped my head back up to attention. Sophia walked out of a portal right in front of me. I looked at her but did not move, not wanting to have Alice get cold again. The plan is working, Sophia said softly, seeing that Alice was sleeping next to me. The humans followed you out, and Alan is stalking them to keep track of where they go and where the lab is located. Good, I stated, my voice sounding deeper as it came out through my mind. Link with Sophia. Despite being a witch, Sophia used magic to be able to communicate with me and my family while in shifter form. What about the wolves? Any sign of them yet? Not yet. It doesn't matter though. Now that we know that it is true how much the humans want her, we can use her as bait and infiltrate the laboratory. I looked down at Alice, still sleeping beside me, a slight smile on her face. Don't you realize what this means, Simon? Sophia urged. After we infiltrate the laboratory, we can figure out why and how they are creating these mutant wolves and destroy them. The mutated rogues will be no more, and you will have avenged little May. You can finally return to our country and see your sister-in-law. At her last words, I finally pulled my eyes off of Alice's gorgeous face. No, I said before even realizing it. What? Sophia asked, just as shocked. What about Alice? I asked. Is there a way to fix her? Not that I know of, Simon. She is not a werewolf or human. She seems to be something else entirely. She is not mad and seems to have more control as well.
which is unlike any other mutated rogue I have ever encountered.
Sophia sighed. I have studied the rogues you have sent me, but I can't promise anything.
I have no idea how long she could live or if she would eventually go crazy as well. And the laboratory is obviously serious about getting her. They must need her for something. They won't stop. I continued to look at Sophia and knew what she was saying was right. I looked back down to Alice. You need to give up on Alice, she continued. You don't belong on this continent anyway, and the only reason you got involved with this rogue mess was for that little girl. Alice should not exist. The whole mutated species should not exist in this world. The best thing to do is destroy the science at the laboratory and then the whole entire species, including Alice. I shifted back into my human body and leaned over Alice protectively. There was a piece of hair across her face, and I grabbed it lightly before softly tucking it behind her ear. She subconsciously leaned her face into my hand. Her brow was still wrinkled even in sleep. I thought of her fierce, persistent eyes and the fire she had inside of her. The stubborn eyebrows that would appear whenever she was quarreling with me. I thought of everything. The happiness in her eyes as I had teased her. I thought of how we had hugged and how she had felt as she relaxed into my arms, or how she had looked at me when I had brushed her lips with my finger. The blush that would cover her cheeks when I teased her. She doesn't belong here, Sophia noted softly, interrupting my thoughts. I also don't belong here, I replied boldly, but there's another homeless little thing that needs me. And I can't abandon her, Sophia. You know, I have wandered for years, but maybe it's time to make a home? You'd be willing to leave your country behind your family? Sophia asked in shock. I looked back down at the beautiful girl below me and couldn't help but smile. If that's what she wants, then yes. At my words, Alice moved below me, and I looked to see her wonderfully wicked eyes staring right back at me. Had she heard what I said? What are you doing? She asked, but I could see the blush creeping up her cheek. I looked up to see Sophia hadn't left and was instead staring down at Alice with a smile on her face. Her eyes then flicked to me. She really is beautiful, Simon. Alice's head whipped around to the sound of Sophia's voice and my eyes widened. What happened to keeping this all a secret? Alice's body pressed back into mine, scooting further from Sophia. What? She asked, looking between the two of us.
Sorry, I didn't know what to do, but before I could come up with a solution, Sophia gave a small nod and waved her hand in the air.
Suddenly, Alice's body started to relax, and I watched as her eyes fought to remain open. Knowing she was dozing off, I raced around to the other side of her and landed in place just in time to catch her from falling over and hitting her head. My eyes lifted to Sophia as panic took over. What did you do? I asked through our connection. Sophia's smile didn't falter. Don't worry, she's all right. I just used a spell to put her back to sleep, best to avoid questions. I'm sure you'll come up with a good reason for my appearance. But please remember, although she is beautiful, she is our subject, and we need to find out more about her to learn how to manage the rogue wolves. Understood. I looked down at Alice, who slept peacefully at my side. A knot formed in my stomach at Sophia's words, but I knew she was right. This was my mission only. The more time I spend with Alice, the more I realized how hard it was becoming to remember that. I nodded, giving Sophia the physical confirmation she needed. At this, she grinned and nodded back. Good. You'll be hearing from me soon. Goodbye, Simon. And with that, she vanished. Right at this moment, Alice moaned suddenly, and I saw her frown. Maybe she dreamed of something unpleasant. I carefully took Alice into my arms and brushed her hair with my hand, hoping to soothe her. I was here. If it hadn't been for the days and days of training all night and working all day, I don't think she would have stayed asleep, but I felt her eyelashes flutter against my chest. as her eyes closed down. I listened to her breathing deepen again and continued to stroke her hair. The longer I laid there, the more convinced I was. I wouldn't let anyone hurt her, even if it killed me. Chapter 17, Duel for the Aged.
Alice's spot.
I slowly blinked open my eyes as the light of the sun fell across my face. As I looked around, I realized that I was still curled up onto Simon's chest. My cheeks flushed as I looked up into his face, but his eyes were closed and I realized he must be asleep. I took the opportunity to stare openly at his face for the first time. Simon looked much younger as he slept. His seriousness and his underlying sadness seemed to be gone when his eyes were closed, making his face softer. I reached my hand up before I realized what I was doing and was just about to place it against his face when I heard a throat clear behind me. Without a thought, I tried to roll away from Simon, but at the sound, Simon became alert and grabbed me before I could get away, pulling me behind him as he stood up as quickly as possible. Then I felt him still slightly. I glanced from behind his back to see none other than the Alpha King standing there strongly in the dawn light. My father. Shit. Before thinking, I naturally dropped to my knees and bowed my head. Simon, on the other hand, still stood protectively in front of me. He relaxed at seeing who it was, but still didn't move. "Hello, Your Majesty," Simon said with a quick nod of his head. "I am surprised to see you out here. One of my guards just informed me of your location, so I came right away." His deep voice seemed to boom through the clearing. Even with my head bowed, I could feel as his gaze turned to me. "We have been out all night looking for you. Alice, you know better than to take off out of the palace without permission." "Forgive me," I said meekly. "It was my fault," Simon stated calmly in his serious teacher voice. "I took her out." I raised my head to see the Alpha King looking at us in confusion and irritation. He wasn't a true father to me in the way he acted, but coming upon us must have made him worry that his control over me wasn't as strong as it used to be. "And what exactly did you bring her out here for?" he asked as he raised his eyebrow. Simon was still shirtless, and I had been laying against him, so it definitely wasn't a great look. "I brought her over for training." "Did you not tell me to train all of your children?" Simon still remained indifferent sounding. It almost hurt, but then I remembered that he was just as good an actor as me, so maybe last night meant as much to him as it had to me. "Training?" The Alpha King looked at us in disbelief. "Alice has a very special physique, so it would almost be pointless to train her. She doesn't even have the power of an Omega." "I did tell you to train my children, but I thought it obvious that she should not." "I believe that you are wrong, sir. I have been training Alice for a short period of time, and she has improved immensely in her fighting abilities. She even managed to wound me," Simon said, and showed him the small scars that were still on his shoulder as proof. "None of your other children or soldiers has managed that yet, so I see no reason not to train Alice as a normal shifter." My chest puffed in pride, and I sat up straighter than before. I didn't know that I had been the first to actually draw his blood, and I wasn't going to add the fact that it had looked like he let me bite him. I glanced at my father. If I thought he looked shocked before, it was nothing compared to now the idea of me being strong, capable, or even better than his other kids seemed incomprehensible to him. He stared at us as if trying to do complex math. "Alice, you are talking about Alice, right?" His brow wrinkled. "I don't believe it." "It's true," Simon simply said. The Alpha King looked around suddenly, and after a moment turned his attention back to us. "This is not a safe space. We must return to the palace," he stated with the command of a king in his voice. "Simon, please do not take Alice out of the palace so casually in the future. I forbade Alice from leaving the palace because it is not safe out here. I worry for my daughter with all of these mutated rogues around.
Simon nodded his head in understanding, but I could tell he was biting his tongue.
He knew better than to believe the king's words, just like me. However, neither of us were going to say that to him either.
Now let's go, my father continued. He turned and started to walk away, expecting and knowing that we would follow. As we made our descent back down to the palace, I turned to Simon, who walked in line beside me. When I woke up earlier, I saw a woman. I whispered to him while we followed a little behind the Alpha King. Who was she? At my question, I noticed Simon stiffened slightly, and then he shook his head, looking at me with furrowed brows. What woman? I narrowed my eyes at him. You know what I'm talking about, Simon, the tall, urethral-looking woman that was speaking to you. She said I was beautiful. That one. Simon chuckled lightly under his breath. You were clearly dreaming. There was no woman. Alice? His gaze was resolute. I wanted to push him, but I knew it wasn't the place nor the time, especially with the Alpha King not far out of earshot. So I swallowed my pride just this once and continued forward. We walked in silence the whole way back to the palace, with me attempting to keep my distance from Simon. I didn't need any more questions coming up about him and what we were doing last night. But I knew he was keeping something from me. I wasn't dreaming. I knew it in my core. Then another thought crossed my mind for the first time in my life. I had been comfortable and felt safe enough to fall asleep next to someone else. I had a hard time even sleeping in a room without a lock. And here I was, falling asleep with a man I liked in a wide open field.
And I wasn't denying it to myself anymore. I liked Simon. Now, the real question was just if he liked me back. Simon kept enough distance between us on the way back to not look suspicious, but also didn't pull too far ahead. It was as if he didn't want to leave me, and that was promising. When we returned to the palace, I saw the whole training group standing out front and dipped my head like a scolded kid. That was basically what I was. They all started to whisper as they saw us.
Alice, you stay here for now, the Alpha King said, instantly spiking my anxiety. Simon, let's go have a private chat. I shot Simon a look that was obviously begging him not to leave me alone with these pirates, but he just gave me a look of encouragement and followed the Alpha King. As soon as the two men were gone, I watched as Olivia separated herself from the group and came marching up to me. The rage on her face was nothing new, so I just braced myself. Well, if it isn't the ugly bitch, Olivia began in her normal taunt, followed by a forceful shove. So tell me, Trash, how was your one night of freedom with Mr. Simon? Did he kick the shit out of you? I bet you deserved it. I ignored her as normal, knowing that if I talked, she would just continue the tirade. I don't know about that, Sister James said from behind Olivia. One of the guards said they saw her fly by on the back of a wolf. So it sounds to me like it was more of a joy ride. What? Olivia asked in a deadly voice as she snapped her eyes back to me. Have you seen his wolf? What does it look like? I had forgotten that nobody else had seen Simon's wolf, and that I was the first. He is such a strong fighter that he didn't have to rely on his shifter body, even when fighting. I heard murmurs from the rest of them, including William, wondering what he looked like. Like I would tell them anything. A slap came hard across my face as Olivia lost her patience. I asked you a question, you piece of shit. Now answer me, or Mr. Simon won't be the only one kicking the shit out of you. My cheeks stung, and I felt my eyes fill with rage, so I kept them aimed to the earth. I can't believe Mr. Simon is actually willing to turn into a wolf and take you out to train.
Olivia said, and I could hear the jealousy in her voice. I don't believe it. I doubt it even happened. Oh, it did, I said, nastily, unable to bite my tongue any longer. And he's been training me for a decent amount of time now. He said I was advancing much better than any of his other students. I bet I could even kick your ass now. The fire burned brighter than I had ever seen in Olivia's eyes, and she took another step and growled at me. She was ignited and ready to take out all of her rage on me in full force, with something telling me that what she'd done before was her going easy on me.
Prove it.
I braced myself ready for a fight when I heard a noise behind me.
Good idea. Olivia Simon's calm voice cut between us, and we both looked in his direction. Simon now stood with a button up back on Sadly next to the Alpha King, and they were both staring at me and Olivia. What do you mean? Mr. Simon, Olivia asked innocently, flipping her hair.
But it was the Alpha King that responded.
It has been decided that Alice will be allowed to train with you all as a group. I stared at him in shock, my mouth actually dropping open. If she can prove her strength and defeat Olivia in a duel.
Great. I was really starting to enjoy the private ones that I was getting.
I looked at Simon and found him staring at me and smiling, even though only I could see the tiny smile on his face and that charming dimple. It still made me angry.
What was he planning? Didn't he want to train me alone? Why did he want me to duel with Olivia? He didn't appear worried at all. But I was terrified. Sure, I'd fought Simon, but that was practice. He wasn't going to show his true strength. Olivia, however, wouldn't hold that. He didn't like me. He wanted to get rid of me. He asked me to duel Olivia without considering that I might get hurt or even die. After realizing that he was about to come towards me, I pushed through the crowd and ran away. I heard him calling me from behind, but I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't fight. I knew I wouldn't win against an alpha-born shifter. My purpose was to escape from the palace and go to the human world, so I didn't want to put myself in danger. I never wanted to be a powerful shifter, let alone duel with an alpha wolf for some purpose. It's not something I should be doing. If I won, Simon wouldn't be my personal trainer anymore. He doesn't understand me, and I feared that that was more the reason I left than anything. The burning gaze that fell on my back never took it off, and as I ran away, they were like silk threads being taut and constantly pulling at my heart. I felt an indescribable tingling. I lost almost all my strength, but I didn't stop in the end. An exclamation erupted in the crowd, and I didn't know what they said to Simon. Maybe I let Simon down. And that's not what I wanted to see. Chapter 18, Simon's Puffle. Watching Alice run away made my heart clench. She must have misunderstood and thought it was me who wanted her to duel Olivia. Although when the Alpha King made this request, I did not refuse. There was my selfishness in this, but I hoped that Alice would take this opportunity to build herself confident. No matter how much she aspired to be human, she was a shifter. She had the characteristics of a wolf, and she was not weak. I wanted everyone to recognize that so that no one dared to bully her anymore. Seeing the redness on her face almost made me lose control, but I quickly calmed down. Where I couldn't protect her all the time, I need to teach her to protect herself. I wanted her to show off her attack in a way that no one would ever underestimate her. I knew I needed to talk to her, but obviously I had to deal with the matter here first. What's more, the Alpha King was still here, and I had to make him believe that Alice would definitely participate in the duel. Whoa, everyone. I spoke in my clear voice, though. I had just withdrawn my gaze from Alice's back as she disappeared around a corner. Don't get too excited. It's not going to be right now. We have to give each contender a chance to prepare for the duel. So that way it is a fair fight. You've got to be joking. James was yelling she's pathetic. I don't want to train with her.
Why do I have to duel her? Olivia whined in her typical annoying voice.
Anger sparked in my eyes, silencing both of them. I watched the Alpha King stare in surprise and a little respect at the control that I had over my student.
First of all, James, I am the teacher, not you. And I don't want to hear another word about who or how I train. I shut my eyes at Olivia. Secondly, Olivia, were you not just saying that you wanted to fight? What better way than a fair duel? If you guys are so convinced that she is as weak as you say, then why are you worried unless you're concerned about losing? No, of course not. Olivia quickly replied. James was smart for once and kept his mouth shut. I could defeat her with my eyes closed. Perfect. Then it's settled. The Alpha King stated, looking at them all, the duel will be for tomorrow at the dueling arena. I will see you all there.
Wait, I have no problem with this. Olivia began innocently, but Alice ran away. Who's to say she won't do the same tomorrow?
She didn't run away, I clarified. We trained the whole night yesterday and she's tired.
She needed rest.
My voice was calm. I knew this wasn't true, but I was going to convince them. If that's the case, I look forward to seeing her at tomorrow's duel. The Alpha King nodded and prepared to leave, giving me my chance to finally check on Idas. However, Olivia's voice stopped me.
That's not fair. She whined from behind me as her father left. Why does she get more special training and I don't? What if I wanted one-on-one training?
If you want more training later as well, then that is fine. But right now, I need to prepare information for Alice to explain to her how all of this will work.
It'll be her first duel, and especially as shifter. So it's important for fairness that she also knows all of the facts.
Olivia groaned. Fine, she probably needs the extra help anyway. Either way, I'll still win. And with that, she turned her nose up to the air and faced away from me, finally granting me reprieve. Without further delay, I walked towards the maid's residence.
Alice's puff. I heard a soft knock on my door. Not long after I ran out, I knew it was Simon, and secretly I was waiting for him. The door handle turned, and he walked in. As soon as he closed the door to my room, I opened my mouth to speak, but was instantly silenced as Simon grabbed my face in his hand and turned it slightly to the side. My breath caught at the feeling of his skin on mine. I noticed that he looked concerned. This was unexpected. I thought he would be angry. How does your cheek feel? He asked in a neutral voice, as if he was trying not to show emotion. Does it hurt? What I asked in confusion, and then it dawned on me. Oh, you mean from the slap? That was nothing. I'm fine. Sure, he asked again. Yes, I've had much worse than that. I chuckled humorlessly. A slap is seriously nothing. Don't worry. I watched as the anger flashed in his eyes again at my words and looked at him in confusion. He had known I was abused and had even seen it before. Has it always affected him this much? Or did he care about me? So, can you tell me why you don't want to train privately with me anymore? I asked, walking away from him so I didn't have to look in the eye. Sometimes I hated that I was so good at reading people. Some things I would rather not know. It's not that I don't want to train with you privately anymore, he said slowly. When I talked with the Alpha King, he had already discovered that I have been training you secretly. I just thought it better to avoid any more future questions by convincing him to let you train with the rest. I just nodded my head and he seemed to realize I still wasn't thrilled with the idea. Plus, with how fast you are learning, I think it would be more beneficial for you to learn more practical combat experience with your peers. Especially since they are more equal to you in strength than me. So you have more of a fighting chance against them. Speaking of, I sat on the edge of my bed. Is there a reason why I have to duel with Olivia in order to get into class? Nobody else had to fight for a spot. That was the Alpha King's stipulation because he still doesn't believe what I said about you. He said, though I thought you would enjoy getting to fight Olivia, payback for years of misery. Aren't you afraid that I will let you down? Olivia is an alpha wolf, but I hesitated. The silence was thick before he broke it with a laugh. Is that why you ran away? I blushed. The real reason was obviously more than that, but I couldn't let him know. Olivia beat me up for years, and intellectually, I could say she's an idiot. She's definitely no match for me. But in terms of physical confrontation, she had an innate advantage. And I had a shadow for many years. Even though I had been trained, I was better than before. But I didn't think I could beat Olivia. Olivia wouldn't be soft. She would not miss any opportunity to kill me. Don't doubt yourself, or you're doubting me as your teacher and Olivia's. I'm serious about telling you that you can beat her. You even managed to hurt me, didn't you? He affirmed. I wanted to argue that it was because he let me last night, and he did it on purpose. But he held out a finger and pressed it against my lips, stopping me from speaking. He seemed to read my words, and his eyes sparkled. Getting your opponent to let their guard down is also a strategy. Combat requires strength and strategy, and that's what you're good at, isn't it? He continued. You just have to believe in yourself, or rather, believe in me. Can you do it? He removed his finger from my lips and looked at me with encouraging eyes. The cold touch of his fingers still remained on my lips, and I couldn't deny that I had some attachment. Believe it or not, you can now even beat the guards and leave the palace. The guards in the northwest corner are the weakest, and I'm sure they're no match for you. He lowered his voice and winked at me. I stared at him in disbelief and opened my mouth wide. What does he mean? Doesn't he know that I had always wanted to escape the palace, or is he encouraging me to escape? He didn't even care that I could leave. My eyelashes dropped, covering the loss in my eyes, but his next words made my heart lift again. The duel will be for tomorrow at noon at the dueling arena. I hope to see you tomorrow, Alice. His tone had a hint of pleading that I couldn't avoid. I think you just want to see someone fight for you. I attempted to tease, though. I could feel my nerves starting to grow. I looked up in time to see Simon smile at me. You are coming to be my official student. Don't you want to fight for the teacher? He teased. I scoffed at him, playing off how nervous I was starting to feel. Simon seemed to sense it, though, because he knelt down on the floor in front of me and looked up at me. He put his hand on my knee in what he probably thought was a soothing way. But instead, anywhere he touched made my skin burn. I am just doing as the Alpha King asks of me. He is the one who brought me here, and he could easily send me off. Simon squeezed. His eyes looked at me questioningly. You don't want that, do you? No, of course not, I said breathlessly as I looked into his intelligent eyes. He looked as if he was still wanting answers, but before he could ask the questions, there was a light knock on the door. I stood up and walked to the door, taking a steadying breath before opening the door. What is this I hear about a duel with Olivia that is happening tomorrow? Joan asked instantly in a huff as soon as I opened the door. And what about the gossip that you have been secretly training with that pretentious teacher? I quickly stood to the side so that she could see that Simon was in my room. At first, she looked shocked and stared at me in disbelief. But then her face turned white as she realized what she had just said. and she instantly began to apologize. "Don't apologize to me," Simon said as he walked up and held his hand out to Joan.
I am the pretentious teacher, and yes, I have been training your daughter in secret for the past few weeks now, and she does indeed have a duel with Olivia tonight.
Joan looked at me in confusion, and I felt my cheeks flush. That only caused her to look at me in even more confusion. I shook my head slightly, trying to signal to her not to say anything. "Wait, what?" Joan looked puzzled as she glanced back and forth between the two of us. "I can see that you guys need some time to talk," Simon said perceptively. "I will go ahead and leave to give you space."
You've got this, don't worry. He winked at me before turning his attention to Joan. It was nice to meet you.
And with that, he was gone. There was a moment of silence before Joan could actually form any words that she wanted to say to me. What she started slowly in the hell was that, "Are you in a relationship with the teacher?" What? Of course not. I did not think that's what she was going to say. No, he has just been teaching me. "But you like him, I can tell." Her eyebrows seemed to be touching her hairline. They were so raised, and you never like anyone spill. "I'm not saying I do or I don't," I blushed, not wanting to lie to Joan. "Well, what can you tell me?" she asked in exasperation. "What is all of this training and Olivia thing that is going on?" Long story short, I convinced Simon to train me knights in secret for the past few weeks, and now for the Alpha King to accept my spot in the other training session. I have to prove myself by defeating Olivia. "Oh boy," Joan stated with a whistle, "dear. You have to be nervous. How are you feeling?" I had no idea. How was I feeling about it? Scared, nervous, all of the above. Somehow, when it came to anything involving Simon, I wasn't so sure anymore, and I really wasn't sure was I going to even go. Chapter 19. The other side of the wall. Alice's pulp. The nerves were still mounting as I walked to the lake. I had continued to talk with Joan in my bedroom, but she had not calmed me down. So I left to get fresh air. It was starting to get late, and I wasn't sure if Simon was still going to show for our regular training session. I hope so. I would much rather keep privately training anyway. Simon was ignorant if he thought I would do well around the rest of the palace wolves. Just because I had gotten comfortable with him, it didn't mean that I was magically going to be comfortable with the rest of them. Simon hadn't tortured me my whole life. I walked up to our usual meeting spot and was hurt to see that Simon wasn't there. Maybe he had gone further into the wood. I walked to the nearby grove. It was a small area in the trees, still covered by branch cover, but big enough to still train in. After a quick evaluation, I realized that Simon wasn't here either. Suddenly, my anger spiked. He set me up for this big duel and didn't want to even help me, besides giving me cryptic advice. What was he playing at?
A sharp pain shot through me, and I held my hands up into the beam of moonlight to watch as they mutated into claws.
I felt my face mutate as well, complete with the wolf teeth, eyes, and fur. It felt like I had to be it all over again. I looked down at my claws in the moonlight. I recalled the pain of pulling these claws out multiple times, but staring at them now just made me feel strength instead of weakness. Training with Simon had indeed made me comfortable with this part of myself. They were what made me who I was. The mutations gave me strength and gave me power that I wouldn't have in this world otherwise. Even though I still couldn't turn into a full wolf and couldn't feel a wolf soul inside my body, the strength coursed through me. Simon's teaching style might be serious, but it obviously was working. Thinking about Simon made me remember the night before when he had taken me to the mountain. And I felt my cheeks redden. I shook my head irritably. He obviously didn't feel the same way about me. He wasn't even wanting to spend nights training me one-on-one anymore.
Simon was a mysterious and dangerous figure. The only reason I had approached him in the first place was to use him. He was a teacher, and I needed to gain enough strength and combat power to escape the palace. If I joined the rest of the wolves for training, it would give away my cover. I had spent years pretending to be weak and harmless, so if I took this duel with Olivia and beat her, I would show them how strong I actually was. Now,
The answer was clear. If I ever wanted to escape from the palace, then I couldn't duel against Olivia. The target on my back didn't need to be any larger than it already was.
now that I thought about it, now would be the perfect time to leave the palace. I was already close to the border.
As Simon said, the guards in the northwest corner of the palace were weak, perhaps because Simon lived here. The Alpha King saw no need to strengthen the defense. Simon was too powerful anyways. He'd get through them easily.
I had almost forgotten my initial plan, and I couldn't recall when my attention had shifted to anything but escaping with Simon. I completely forgot that I wanted to run away. But now I could leave the palace by myself. I was more than capable, so what was I waiting for?
I felt a pulse through my body and looked down to see the mutation beginning to fade away.
With my claws returning to my fingers, I grabbed my cell phone from my secret pocket. Joan at least deserved a message to let her know that I was leaving. When I opened the phone, though, I saw Simon's information at the top of my recents. And before I realized what I was doing, I pressed the dial button. Then I came to my senses and was just about to hang up when I heard Simon's voice.
Hello, he answered, sounding confused.
Yeah, I realized I had never given him my contact information. I had just taken his from Alan. He didn't realize that it was me. It surprised me that he wasn't asleep yet. I had been sitting in the grove for quite a while now, and I figured if he wasn't training me, then he would have gone ahead and went to sleep. I didn't speak. I didn't know what to say. He'd probably hang up soon. Alice, he called out over the phone, and I felt my eyebrows raise. How did you know it was me? I asked. Simon just laughed. What's so funny? I asked, my irritation spiking again. I guessed you would call me, he said, and I could still hear the humor in his voice. So I was waiting for you. The idea that he knew me so well annoyed me even further. Well, you'll just have to keep waiting for me because I'm not going tomorrow, I said angrily. Simon started laughing again. Oh, y'all show, I have no doubt, no offense, Alice, but you're all bark and no bite. I gasped and quickly punched the end button on the cell phone to hang up the call, huffing out an annoyed breath. I had a bite, and if I didn't show tomorrow, he'd definitely see that too. I leaned back against a nearby tree. It reminded me of the time that Simon had pressed me up against it and covered my eyes. Just remembering it now sent tingles across my body. At the time Simon had said that my eyes were ugly back then, his words had still been cold and indifferent, but now, no matter how angry I was, Simon laughed and smiled, and for some reason, his laugh and his smile made me feel happy. I didn't know why Simon was so sure that I would come tomorrow, and for a moment, as I remembered my time with him, I thought about it. I thought about staying, but then I shook the sense back into my head. I needed to escape the palace while I still had a chance. Simon was going to look like a clown, and I was going to be free. Finally, I turned towards the wall, preparing myself to sneak over it, when all of a sudden, I noticed a person sneaking around at the head of the wall, and they were holding a gun in their hands. Simon's bubble. I stared at the flashing screen of my phone that showed me that Alice had ended the call. The smile that was spread on my face suddenly faded, and I felt the strong need to go and find her. When I was talking to her, I had faked confidence, but inside, I really was worried. Not that she wouldn't fight, but that she wouldn't come at all.
I knew she wanted to escape, and tonight I gave her the opportunity to do so. Part of me thought she wouldn't take it, that she'd be too scared. But the other half of me was worried she would. She did have bite, and I knew it. I only said it to get under her skin. But what if I pushed her too far? It's not that I wanted her to leave. No, the person who didn't want her to leave the most was me. But I was going to give her the chance to make a choice. I had no idea what she'd choose. She wanted to leave the palace for so long, to go to the human world. Was there anything here that was worth her staying? I shuddered to think of what punishment would be given to her if she were to not show up for the duel, or if she attempted to escape and didn't make it. I guess one good thing about her leaving would be that they couldn't punish her if she wasn't here. I had watched her walk up to the lake and wait for me earlier tonight, but I kept myself from going out to meet her. She needed to make this decision for herself, no matter how hard it was for me. If she didn't want to fight Olivia, then I couldn't make her. I knew she was upset about ending the private training as well, but we couldn't train privately forever, especially when the Alpha King already knew. I was not afraid of the Alpha King, but before I achieved my goal, this was not a good time to conflict with the Alpha King. My intentions were still pure in the way that I was here to defeat the human lab and the mad, mutated wolves. But how was I supposed to explain that I had grown attached to Alice and that I trained her, knowing fully well that she was just trying to get strong enough to leave? But once I had heard her voice over the phone, I knew I couldn't stay away any longer. So I left the building and headed to the grove. I had seen her walk in that direction. It didn't take me long to find her, but as I came up behind her, my breath caught as I saw the human standing on top of the wall. Then I heard movement from beside me, and I moved quickly, wondering if they were already inside and were planning to surround her. However, the person holding the gun from beside me turned out to be Joan. She must have followed Alice out here out of worry, but I was surprised that I hadn't noticed her sooner. Nobody could usually go unnoticed by me. I made a mental note to find out more information about her later. I had thought she was a simple human palace chef. I saw that her gun in her hands was pointed at me, so I instantly reached out and tapped into my wolf strength to bend the barrel of her gun up. I couldn't leave anything to chance. Joan recognized me then, and her eyes widened as she opened her mouth to speak, shaking my head. I made a gesture to let her know to be quiet and pointed to the human that was on the wall. Alice had noticed him now, and they seemed to be in a deadlock. The human spy made the first move. Joan instantly responded, trying to get to Alice, but I held her back in a way. I had to hold myself back as well. I wanted her to see how strong Alice was now, and I knew she would respond correctly. I was her teacher, after all. I had to have faith in her. She stopped in time to watch as Alice simultaneously shifted and leapt up onto the wall with impressive agility. Alice knocked the gun out of the human's hands and sliced at him. There was a terrified, pained scream outside of the wall, and then there was silence. In the moonlight, Alice sat at the top of the wall and stretched out her claws until they slowly returned to her hand. The one hand was still stained with blood so dark that I could see it from where I stood. My heart stopped for a moment as she looked over the wall outside of the palace. Would she do it? Would she take the chance to escape? I wouldn't blame her if she did, but I didn't want her to leave. I heard Joan's breath catch in her throat. I wanted to yell to her and stop her, but she needed to make this decision on her own. And then she plunged down and over the other side. Chapter 20, a champion is born.
Simon's pop the following day.
I sat silently on the judging stage, holding my injured shoulder. I barely slept. Between the pain and dreams of Alice leaving the palace, I found myself tossing and turning all night.
The duel was supposed to start soon. It was already getting late, and I hadn't seen her since she jumped.
I had spent the morning hoping that she had returned, that maybe she had second doubts and would come back.
Maid.
But I hadn't heard from her since our phone call and didn't see her anywhere around the grounds all day. Maybe she really did leave. Olivia, on the other hand, I had crossed paths with everywhere. It always seemed that she was around no matter how hard I tried to avoid her. Now, she was cuckily flaunting around the stands and saying how excited she was about this duel. She would tell anyone that would listen that she was going to teach Alice a lesson once and for all. Every time she talked, I ground my teeth together to keep from snapping or saying something I'd regret. I couldn't seem biased, especially at the judges' table. The Alpha King was also acting as a judge, which meant I had to listen to James and William complain about the duel the entire time. I checked the time. It was close to the beginning of the duel and Alice still hadn't shown. I was starting to get concerned. I brought a guard over and they didn't have any updates concerning her either. The restlessness was growing. Mr. Simon, it seems that if Alice won't show, we can put an end to this farce, the Alpha King stated as he began to ride. It seems that she decided to give up this opportunity we so graciously presented her with. And my daughter is getting anxious. Your Majesty, I began calmly trying to hide my own nerves, if I may. It's not 12 o'clock. There are still just minutes left. Mr. Simon, my time is precious. He was growing impatient. I could tell. Your Majesty, you and I are both punctual people. I understand. What's the harm? I insisted as if I never doubted Alice would come. Fine, I can wait another rest of minutes, Mr. Simon. But if Alice doesn't show, you will stop training her. The Alpha King demanded, it's a waste of your talents. Understood. The tone of voice in which he spoke of Alice made me angry, and I was about to answer when the crowd began to murmur loudly amongst themselves. I looked to where their gazes landed and saw Alice as she entered the building. She looked nervous and tense, but she was here. She stayed. Alice's puff. I walked into the stadium prepared for the duel. Everyone was quiet and looked surprised as I slowly walked up. Well, everyone except Simon, he was beaming. I could see it because my eyes went straight to him. After I found the human on the palace side of the wall, I used my mutations to defend myself just as Simon taught me, and finally tasted my first true victory. It was invigorating, but then when I was about to jump down and return to the lake, I saw another figure running away in the distance on the other side of the wall. Thanks to my mutated ears, I heard him cry out in horror. Is this God's gene? God's gene, what's that? So many questions raced through my mind. Who were they and why were they after me? I had nothing special about me. I had to try and find answers. One had just breached the wall, who was to say they wouldn't again. So I jumped down and followed them, only to lose them halfway through. When I returned later that night, I found Joan sitting by my bedside crying. Only when I touched her shoulder did she realize I hadn't gone. She told me that she and Simon witnessed everything, and after consoling her, I decided to use this to my own advantage. If Simon thought I had truly left, maybe I could gauge his reaction around the palace and see how my disappearance actually affected him. It's also the reason I avoided him until the very last second, 12 o'clock on the dot. Most of the people here had probably assumed I wouldn't come.
I had done a good job over the years of making myself appear as a simple, humble, and weak maid.
Nobody truly thought I would have the strength to even show up, let alone fight Olivia. It wasn't hard to convince them.
The only thing they had ever noticed about me or cared about was my beauty.
I saw quite a few men turn their heads as I walked by. The women, however, looked at me in jealous hatred, and that included Olivia. She was most likely pissed I cared to even show.
I started second-guessing my decision to come, to stay rather. Why did I? I still had no idea myself.
I had been set on leaving last night, poised on the wall and ready to jump, but I just couldn't do it.
Part of it was the fact that I needed to find out more about this new enemy that seemed to be against me. I couldn't protect myself against an enemy that I didn't know.
But the other reason was Simon. I had sat there for a moment, and Simon was truly what was on my mind.
Well, him and Joan, but Joan would have understood if I had left. Simon, on the other hand, I couldn't abandon.
He had never left me, and I just couldn't find myself repaying that by leaving him. Maybe he wouldn't even care, but I had come to rely on him as a constant in my life, and I couldn't imagine leaving without even saying goodbye.
So here I was standing in an arena, about to blow my whole cover, just in order to see Simon's reaction, what was happening to me.
I rejected the urge to roll my eyes as Olivia started to walk toward me.
Wow, the ugly bitch actually showed up. Olivia sneered quietly, so just the other three of us could hear her any last word. Good luck, I answered as nicely as possible, catching her by surprise. Her eyes widened and then narrowed as the sound of the Alpha King's clap resonated through the room.
It is time, the Alpha King announced, commanding the room into silence. I took a deep breath. This would be my true test. With one last snarl, Olivia transformed into a huge gray wolf right in front of my eye. She growled once more in an attempt to scare me. As soon as they saw Olivia's wolf, the crowd went wild. Me, on the other hand, many of the men that constantly made advances towards me kept asking for me to please protect my beautiful face. They even yelled for me to ask for help, and they would jump in as needed.
Man, maybe my damsel in distress, it worked a little too well with some of them.
Instead of responding to any of them, I simply grinned. Olivia seemed a little taken aback, but didn't retreat in the slightest. Just as the Alpha King was about to ring the bell to start, William jumped down onto the floor squarely in front of the judging table.
Wait, he yelled out, the surrounding chatter hushed as everyone stopped to listen.
I ask as Alice's maid to be able to fight on her behalf.
William continued, standing up straight.
I quickly glanced at Simon to see him stiffen slightly at William's words. A frown crossed his face, and he leaned over and said something to the Alpha King. The Alpha King nodded.
I apologize, William, but even if you say that you are maids, you have not fully bonded, so you have no right in this matter. He gestured to the guards, get him out of here, and don't let him interfere.
Then without warning, the bell went off and the duel officially began.
Olivia immediately lunged for me. She opened her mouth wide, obviously going for the kill shot. As she aimed for my neck, I shouldn't have been surprised.
I dodged to the side, just barely parrying the attack away from me. My size was so small in comparison to her large wolf, and it took more power than expected to bat her away.
She kept relentlessly pursuing me, never giving me a second to breath as I worked my hardest to dodge her attacks. Until finally, I felt the stinging pain when her claws sliced across me and cut through my skin as I failed to fully avoid them.
Olivia paused for a second to enjoy her power and relish in the idea that she would soon defeat me.
I heard the gasps of the men around me, upset at seeing me possibly scarred, but I paid them no attention. At the sight of my own blood, my rage and passion for fighting seemed to surge to the front.
and I focused all of my attention on Olivia and on how I could defeat her.
As I stared at her, she lunged once more. But this time, I was ready. I was going to win. Simon's paused. I held back the growl that wanted to leave my lips at the things these men were shouting at Alice while she fought against Olivia. I looked around at them in disgust and realized that many of the ones that couldn't keep their eyes off of her already had their own mates. I remembered the argument that we had on the mountain the other night and understood a little more why she had not been convinced of the mate bond. I made a mental note to remember all of these inappropriate comments and who they came from. Watching Alice getting injured over and over again was a lot harder than I thought, but I kept my face neutral as the battle continued. It was easy to stay calm when I was sure she would win. The more injuries she got eventually forced her mutations out, and she switched from the defense to offense. Olivia was not expecting this, so Alice easily made contact with a few attacks, drawing blood. Then, as soon as there was an opening, Alice leaped onto Olivia's back. No matter how hard Olivia tried, she couldn't shake Alice off of her. Alice had dug her claws in and tucked in close. Then, as Olivia tired, Alice reached a sharp claw around and pressed it against her eye. The crowd went silent. Admit defeat, or I will blind you, Alice said clearly through the silence. Olivia growled deep and loudly. She nipped the air in an attempt to reach for Alice, who simply smiled. She was free to be who she always was in here in front of everyone. And it was a sight to see. Without a word, Alice flicked her wrist and sliced right above Olivia's eye. Olivia yelped out in pain, frustration, and fear, and then slowly bowed to admit final defeat. That was it. Alice had won. Alice jumped off of Olivia's back and stood in the ring, straightening her back as she looked around at the shocked crowd. Her gaze slipped by me. She hadn't looked at me a single time since the duel had begun. I started to wish that she would. Then I saw Olivia. With a growl, she leaped at Alice in rage, claws and teeth bared, meaning to kill.
Alice turned, but her mutations had already faded, and she was barely standing as it was after such a vicious fight. Olivia knew this and understood if she caught her off guard, she wasn't going to be able to dodge the attack.
I heard William let out an exclamation and try to get away from the guards to help. The crowd gasped, and the men screamed at the idea of losing their beauty. But I wouldn't let that happen. My hand reached out and grabbed Alice's waist and pulled her behind me just in time. I took my other hand and easily punched up under Olivia's jaw, snapping her teeth shut and sending her flying into the wall of the ring. She winced as she hit the wall, but I didn't care. I turned my attention to Alice. The crowd finally roared back to life, and I wasn't sure if it was in joy or outrage. But that wasn't what I was worried about. I could feel Alice's body trembling against my hand from pure shock, and I tried to hide how much I was supporting her. I leaned in so that I could whisper into her ear. "Can you hold on? Can you make it?" I whispered softly. Alice glared at me fiercely, and I had to quickly control myself in order to not start laughing. If she was still in the spirit to scold me, then she must be just fine. I felt her body strengthen slightly and was impressed by her sheer will. Unable to help myself, I wrapped an arm around her and whispered, "Good girl." Alice pushed my arm away sassily, but I grabbed onto her hand tightly and didn't let her shake it off. I raised her hand strongly into the air before turning toward the judging table. I stared at the Alpha King. "The winner of this duel is Alice," I yelled out clearly. The crowd was still going crazy, but I kept my attention on the Alpha King. He had to accept her, now as one of my students. It was a given. He rose to his feet, and the crowd went quiet once more.
Simon, you have done something amazing with Alice. You have found a power in her abilities that we overlooked by focusing too much on the presence of a wolf soul. The Alpha King said lightly, "You have both proven yourselves well today."
Thank you, I said with a small bow of my head. I will make one thing clear, though, while everyone is gathered.
Alice is my best student and has advanced faster than anyone else. If anyone is disrespectful toward her, then I will take that as a sign of disrespect to me. None of my students will harass each other in the future. Am I clear?
My gaze swept over the crowd, specifically landing on the wolves who had been saying such disgusting things towards Alice. All of the wolves bowed their heads in understanding. I heard Alice gasp beside me.
I wasn't sure if she was surprised by me or that the shifters were actually agreeing to treat her with respect.
I didn't risk looking down at her. I just squeezed her hand and didn't let go. However, wolves weren't the kind of species that were good with change. And little did I know our troubles were far from over.
Chapter 21, Patient Alice's Pop.
My arm throbbed as Simon continued to hold it in the air. One of the swipes that Olivia had landed had grazed this arm and sighed. I was trying to be strong, but I couldn't help a gasp that escaped. Simon seemed to notice and lowered my arm, looking down at me in concern. I could still hear the crowd murmuring around me. Most of them were in awe, my cheeks flushed at all of the attention.
Why did you force me to do this? I grumbled out as I wobbled slightly. I was pretty sure that I had twisted one of my ankles, trying to evade attacks as well. Without answering, he suddenly bent over and grabbed my legs, pulling me up and into his arms.
I wrapped my arms around his neck naturally, despite the fact that I was still annoyed with him.
I would never tell him, but I was glad he did it. I wasn't sure how much longer I could have stood up.
I will take her back to my place to tend to her wounds, Simon announced as he looked toward the Alpha King. William stepped forward as if he was going to object, but with a quick glare from Simon, he stood down. James, however, still didn't get the message, so she just gets to hook up with the teacher. Now James sneered. James, the Alpha King's voice sounded deadly, and James instantly backed away. Then he turned to Simon and looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. Simon's glare was on James and as cold as the Alpha King's voice. I apologize, Simon. I will deal with James, the Alpha King finally said. Go ahead and go take care of Alice. Simon bowed his head and turned to walk off. As he walked, I saw Olivia on the side of the ring. She had turned back into a human, and the blood was still streaming down from her one eye. The glare on her face made it obvious that she hated me, but I noticed her looking jealous at the fact that Simon was carrying me. Being the spiteful person I was, I snuggled closer to Simon and smiled at her. The scowl I got in return was well worth it.
I noticed that I was getting blood all over Simon's nice suit, and I smiled even bigger.
Messing up his perfect presentation of himself made me feel even better. Simon kept walking to his place, and I kept rubbing against him, getting more blood on him. Simon hugged me closer to his body. "Don't move," he said softly, and I wondered if he knew my intentions. Because he told me not to make me want to do it even more now, and I couldn't help but be disobedient. Simon came to a stop. His voice was low as he whispered close to my ear. "Move again, and the wound will open." He paused. "Doesn't it hurt?" His hot breath warmed my skin, but a shiver still passed down my spine. Even though he sounded casual, I could sense strong emotions behind his words. I stopped moving, knowing that he was serious. "It hurts," I scoffed, trying to sound casual as well. Simon seemed to realize that I really was injured, though, because he stared down at me thoughtfully. Then he continued to walk again. However, I noticed that he was moving much lighter and being more careful with his step. "You only have to endure the pain for a little longer," he said quietly.
as he took a deep breath. His tall body wrapped around me as we walked by a small group of people. He turned to take the path that would have fewer people.
It was as if his body was protecting me from all of the mayhem of the world around me. I dropped my head against his shoulder, exhausted even though I wasn't the one walking. Simon's pace quickened slightly, but he still moved more gently than before. When we finally arrived in his room, he placed me on what I assumed was his bed and asked me to lie down. Without even worrying about his bloodied suit, he walked over to the smaller desk and started to grab some ingredient.
You are going to have to take off your clothes so I can apply the medicine to your wounds, Simon said, with his back to me. Without even questioning him, I sat back up and stripped off my clothes carefully in a couple of spots. Then I pulled the covers back and hid my body under them. I should have felt guilty for covering his bed in blood, but I was still mad that I was in this situation anyway. It was all his fault. He wanted me to fight for him, and so I did. I could be gone right now, far away from the palace and everyone inside of it, but I couldn't manage to stay away from him. Deep down, I knew that it wasn't Simon's fault and that I had made all of those choices myself, but man, did it feel good to have someone to blame. Simon turned back around and seemed surprised to find me so obedient and already undressed. Granted, I usually argued with him about everything, but my wounds really were starting to ache. He walked up to the bed with his arms full and started to mix together everything. Swear to God, if this stuff gave me a beard, I would kill him. Turn on your stomach so I can see your back, Simon said softly. It seemed to get the worst of it. I rolled over slowly, making sure that the blanket kept my front covered. Simon took a deep breath as he took my back, and that made me a little worried. I knew I had been hurt, but maybe it was worse than I thought. His hands were cool and gentle as he began to rub ointment over my skin, and I sighed in almost instant relief. Simon was being very cautious. I knew that it should hurt, but at the moment, all I could think about were his hands all over me.
I was used to pain, but I wasn't used to gentle touches.
The room was quiet and tense as Simon continued his work skillfully. He covered my side and my arm in ointment as well. The more he worked on me, the more mad he seemed to get, which just pissed me off even more. What did I do to him?
Done, Simon said, standing up to put away the mixtures.
I grabbed the quilt and pulled it over my head, covering my entire body. I heard him set down the medicine, and he pulled the quilt down off of my face.
Are you angry? Simon asked. No, I said firmly, speaking words for the first time in a while. Simon's lips curled up. So you aren't upset about the duel? Well, I didn't have much of a choice, did I? I snapped back. I told you it was your choice. Simon's smile spread further. I just said I knew that you would choose right. I pursed my lips together and threw the quilt back up and over my head. Simon didn't stop me, and I heard him sit back down next to me with a sigh. Simon's pop. There was a small piece of hair sticking out of the top of the quilt as I stared at the shape beneath it. The injured shape. My eyes zoned out as I thought about the way that Alice had fought for me in the ring. I remembered her stubbornness as she tried so hard while not even looking in my direction a single time. Her puffing up in pride after Olivia had admitted defeat, not speaking a word. I couldn't help but laugh as I remembered my fierce little wolf cub, and I laughed and laughed and laughed. For the first time, I felt like the hole in my heart was filled. It was euphoric. It turned out that all I needed all along was a fiery and stubborn girl who would bring that passion back into my life.
who would test me and bring me back to who I really was, and who would never abandon me, who stayed and fought.
Alice might not understand love, but I was finding myself wanting to teach her. After all, I already taught her so much else, so why not this? I would teach her slowly. I had already been waiting for so many years, so who cares if I had to wait a little longer? She was worth it.
I could picture her running towards me and away from everything else, and I wanted to give that a chance. But I wanted it to be that her choosing me, I wanted to feel what it was like to be chosen. However, I wouldn't give up until she chose me. I stood and bent down quietly, dropping a kiss on the top of Alice's exposed hair. I felt as if the barrier that I had put up to separate me from the world was gone at this moment, and the only thing that mattered was her. Alice pulled down the quilt slowly, and her look of annoyance changed as soon as she saw my expression and knew that I wasn't teasing her. She looked confused, but I saw her cheeks flush slightly. Maybe it would be easier to get her to choose me. Then I thought, whatever you want to do it quickly. Alice said, softer than I was expecting. I hurt to death. In her words, I was reminded of her current condition. However, I could see that she was nervous. What should I do? I asked, slightly teasing her. Her face turned bright red. Now, who knows what you want to do? I laughed and leaned forward, watching as her breath caught. But instead of kissing her like I desperately wanted to at that moment, I grabbed the edge of the quilt and pulled it back up for her. Then I tucked it gently around her and put my hand up to her face to softly tuck her hair behind her ears. My hand lingered on her cheek for a moment before I managed to pull it back. I just want you to get some rest now, I said softly. Sleep will help your body recover faster. Alice looked at me in disbelief, her eyes almost blank. So I brushed my thumb across her eyes, making her shut them, hurry up and sleep. Don't be cranky. I could see her eyelashes trembling slightly, but she didn't reopen her eyes. Why did I have to fight today? Alice asked quietly.
I was quiet for a moment. I didn't realize how much of an issue this was going to be for her.
In my mind, I thought she would have rejoiced at the chance to fight and beat one of her tormentors. But she had a right to know all of my thoughts. Because you are mine, my student, you are precious and cannot be looked down upon any longer. I honestly answered. I wanted them all to see the real you. Am I really your best student? She continued in the same quiet tone. Who else would be? I asked her. I've never spent so much time, energy, or even thought into someone else. Liar, Alice said after a long pause. It almost sounded as if she was jealous, which made me realize who she was talking about. My sister-in-law. I stood there for a moment, thinking about her words. Alice laid there in silence, with her eyes still closed, but I knew that she wasn't asleep. She was waiting for me to respond. I thought for another moment, trying to pick my words carefully. Alice, that's different. You're different. I paused again. How could I make her feel better, but not push my feelings onto her? When I saw you standing in that ring today, I knew that you were better, and it made me really happy. I'm the happiest I've been in nearly a decade. I couldn't resist grabbing Alice's uninjured hand and bringing it to my lips for a sweet and soft kiss. I thought it was a good sign that she didn't rip her hand out of mine immediately. Thank you for coming today, I whispered, and then walked outside to cool myself down. By the time I walked back into my bedroom, I found Alice sleeping deeply with my pillow wrapped in her arms and pressed against her face. I went into the bathroom so I could clean up and wash all of her blood off of me. Then I put on some pajamas and climbed into the bed next to her, staying on top of the quilt. I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity to sleep next to her again. The night on the mountain had been amazing in itself. Her beautiful face had looked so peaceful under the stars, along with the warmth of her body as she had curled into me.
I had said I had patience. I had said I could wait.
Now I was realizing just how hard that would be. Chapter 22, The Mutant Wolf, Alice's Paw.
I took a few more deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. As I leaned against a tree during practice, it had been a few days since my duel, and my life could not have been any more different. Since starting training daily with the rest of the shifters, I was no longer a maid and was actually being treated like a decent shifter for once.
By almost everyone, at least.
I glanced around the tree and back towards the group of people that were training today. Olivia stood off to the opposite side of the area, and even from this distance, I could feel her glare. We had a few classes together by now, and none of them had ended well. I wasn't sure how it was going to be training with Simon in a group setting, but it was even worse than I imagined. Instead of ignoring me like everyone else he trained, he would deliberately go out of his way to embarrass me during training. Just a few minutes ago, he had set a trap so that as soon as I backed up in a spar, I tripped over a large tree branch and fell square in a pile of mud. I had to run off to cool myself down and to not react to him. The frustrating part was that it made me want to run to him even more. I should be pissed, but all I could think about was getting back at him. I wanted to trick him back, only I knew it wasn't a good idea. People had already noticed enough. There were whispers about Simon liking me or me liking Simon. I didn't know which was more embarrassing. William and Olivia both had turned extremely jealous and sour after our first practice.
This caused William to repeatedly challenge Simon during training, as if trying to prove himself to me. He was still convinced he was my mate.
Simon had no problem mercilessly defeating William every single time he tried, but it didn't stop him.
And Olivia's jealousy showed itself by her constant death glares to me. Unlike my experience, Olivia's life was worse after the mat.
The fact that she had lost to me earned her a lot of teasing, which was something she was not used to. She probably would have attempted to challenge me every day as well. But I had heard Simon tell her that I was off limits after the stunt she had pulled at the end of the duel. He said that until she learned how to fight properly, she couldn't fight at all. So now she just sat angrily in the corner, watching us all practice every day, and she never took her eyes off of me, waiting for her time to strike. I was sure, but she would never get that chance as long as Simon was around.
I rolled my eyes and returned to the training. Simon was looking at me as I walked by, but I tried to ignore him. I refused to look at him for the rest of practice.
As the day was coming to an end, more and more people left. But I waited behind, even though he annoyed the crap out of me. The small bit of time I got with Simon, by myself, at the end of practice, made the whole day worth it. I started to daydream about what I would say in our time together tonight, or what I would do. Before I noticed, Olivia had walked up next to me. I took in my surroundings and realized that James and William were missing. No doubt they had taken Simon to distract him so that Olivia could finally talk to me. Of course, she couldn't do it alone, though. There was a small group around her as she approached me. Olivia's own personal supporter. She led them, trying to at least pretend that she still had all the power here. I saw a small scar above her eye, which made me smile in petty pride.
Hey, Alice, we were just wondering if maybe you would like to go outside the palace with us, Olivia said, faking niceness.
Yeah, like that's not suspicious at all, since when did she call me anything other than ugly bitches or torment me? However, this could be my opportunity to get out of the palace again. I had understood after that night on the wall
that I was being watched, and I was curious to find out more. For instance, like why they were spying on me.
Sounds fun, I said, with a smile, using the same tone that she had just used on me.
Olivia looked excited, not suspecting for a moment that I was using her. She gestured for me to follow her, and I willingly did. At least it would be Olivia that got in trouble if we got caught. Not me.
We hadn't gotten far outside when her group slowly started to surround me, as expected.
But it wasn't much longer until I heard other sounds starting to surround me as well.
The group looked around in panic as we could hear growling, getting louder and louder, and then without warning, the giant mutated rogues burst out of the woods around us. Everyone screamed and scattered.
I stayed where I was standing my ground. This wasn't my first time seeing a mad rogue, so I wasn't as frightened as some of the other. Plus, it couldn't be a coincidence that there was an attack the moment I left the palace.
Maybe those human spies had something to do with the mutated shifters.
Olivia transformed into a large gray wolf in front of me, preparing to make a stand as well.
We were the closest to the middle of the group, so we hadn't had the chance to escape like the others that were closer to the gate. One of the other girls that was standing by me screamed and turned to run. I watched a mutant stepped up and bit her head clean off. The body almost seemed to fall in slow motion as I watched, and my blood ran cold. There was another noise to my side, and I whipped my head around. A large pickup had pulled up with a cage in the bed, and I watched as two humans jumped out. They started to walk towards me, and I realized that they meant to put me in the cage. I backed up, but before I could get any further, two of the mutants grabbed me tightly by the arms and used their unnatural strength to throw me into the cage and shut the door. I slammed my head against the bars and was dazed. Now, I was panicking. It all happened so fast that I hadn't had time to think or time to react. I watched as the mutants continued to kill more and more of Olivia's group around me. Olivia herself was fighting hard still, but she had no chance of winning and would most likely die soon as well. This was not good. This was not what I had expected when I left the palace with Olivia. I had assumed that it would simply be more humans that would interfere. The fact that the mutated wolves were there also was terrifying to think of. What did any of this have to do with me? What did they want with me?
I closed my eyes for a moment as my head throbbed and was surprised to see Simon's face in my mind. Maybe I hit my head harder than I thought.
Hopefully, one of the few wolves that had escaped had found him by now, and he was on his way. It wouldn't have taken him long to deal with William and James, and he had to have noticed that I was missing.
I opened my eyes again, determined to not let Simon find me in a cage.
One of the humans started to approach it, no doubt to check on my condition since I had screamed when my head hit the metal. I easily fell back into my normal act of being weak and defenseless to get her to drop her guard. I slowly mutated my hands behind my back, and then as soon as I got the opportunity, I reached out and slashed her through the metal bars. Then I grabbed one in each hand and tapped into my wolf strength to bend them apart enough for my slim body to squeeze through. The humans still laid on the ground, holding the wound I gave them, so I took the opportunity to try and escape. Most of the wolves' attention were on a bleeding Olivia fighting a single mutant wolf. Olivia locked eyes with me, and I watched as she backed her opponent towards me. All of them turned my direction and seemed to realize that I had escaped. She wouldn't let me leave without her. Now it was just me and Olivia, surrounded by multiple mutants. I bent over quickly, pretending to tie my shoe, but tied my ankle to Olivia's now human again ankle instead. If I knew her, she would try and sacrifice me to save herself. And that wasn't happening.
If I was stuck, then so was she. If she escaped, then so did I. I stood up and reluctantly went back to back with this vindictive bitch. I didn't trust her, but I didn't have much choice at the moment.
As if to prove my point, I felt Olivia's hands press against my back as she tried to push me into the pile of shifters that were amassing against us. She shrieked in surprise and annoyance as shoving me pulled her down as well. I quickly rolled to the side before she could land on me, but she lunged for me again, trying to use me for a shield. We continued to scuffle, and the mutants surprisingly didn't lay a hand on us, so they really must care about keeping me alive. Only Olivia would be naive or dumb enough to fight with me while still surrounded by actual enemies. It wasn't too steep of a fall, but it was a miracle that neither of us had hit a tree or got the rope caught in one. I heard the growls from above us as they frantically attempted to follow us down. We didn't have much time. It wasn't like we could outrun them anyway. Olivia screamed out in frustration, aiming another kick at me. You knew this would happen. You knew they were going to attack today, and that's why you agreed to come out here with me. As she screamed, I had the feeling of deja vu spark through me. It didn't seem that long ago that Olivia's crazy mom had decided to take me for a walk outside of the palace as well. The mutants had attacked just like now, and she had thrown me at them, just as Olivia had attempted to. God. I hated this family my whole life. They had beaten me near death or attempted to kill me. And what had I ever done to them? Well, besides in retaliation. The queen had always hated me specifically for being the bastard child of her husband, and I believed that it was her plan to kill me. But it had backfired because it wasn't me that had died that night. Yes, I lied, smiling at her. You, like your mother, will die at the hands of the mutated wolves. Olivia stopped dead in her tracks and genuinely stared at me in shock. Just then, a large growl ripped out from behind us. We both turned to see the largest mutant wolf that we had ever seen. Without hesitation, the mutant leaped at us, claws outstretched and jaw ready to bite. I heard Olivia scream. This was it. Chapter 23, Aftermath, Alice's Pova. The wolf was still bounding at us when all of a sudden there was a loud whistle that sounded through the entire trees. I clapped my hands over my ears. Even without wolf hearing, that whistle was piercing. Then he came to a stop. Suddenly, without another look towards me or Olivia, he turned and took off. I stared after him in surprise, wondering what on earth could have made them retreat, and so quickly they had almost gotten up. It had to be Simon. Please be Simon. Olivia's fist suddenly flew at my face from the side, and I didn't have time to react as it made contact with my cheek. My entire body twisted around at the angle and strength of which she hit me. Were you that fucking dumb? Yeah, I screamed as my already injured head throbbed again. I pulled the rope that tied us together as far apart as possible so I could keep my distance. That's for what you said about my mom, Olivia shrieked back, and then she came at me again, tackling me to the ground. And this is for the attack, you filthy fucking trash. Skate. I pushed her over and rolled on top, getting a few good hits of my own before I felt arms grabbing at me and pulling me off her. The touch was familiar to me, so I easily gave in as they pulled me back. Simon was there and he looked worried. He grabbed both sides of my face and turned my head from side to side, examining me. Then he continued his exam down the rest of my body. When he got to the rope on my ankle, he bent and quickly removed it, rubbing the rash that it had caused.
I looked over and saw that the Alpha King had arrived as well and was tending to his more important daughter. Simon stood back up and I saw relief in his eyes, but with the relief also came anger.
What were you thinking, Alice?
Simon scorned. Why didn't you call me? Don't you have your phone? He sounded so anxious, and for the first time it made my heart hurt. I wanted to comfort him, and I felt bad that it was me that had caused him all this worry. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around his waist and pulled my face against his chest in a hug. His breath caught at first, but then I felt him relax and put his arms around me and lean his chin against the top of my head. I was just worried, he whispered down, only loud enough for me to hear. The feeling of his arms wrapped around me was making my body tingle, and the adrenaline that was still filling my body was giving me some very naughty ideas and thought. Definitely not stuff I wanted to do for the first time in front of my so-called family. After a minute, I unwillingly pulled away and took on a serious tone. Back to business as usual.
Do you know something about me? I asked Simon and watched as his eyebrows raised. Do you know why these humans were trying to arrest me?
Simon's eyes flashed, and I could tell that he did indeed know something.
I don't know either, he said, and I stared at him in surprise.
Had Simon just lied to me? I didn't think he would ever lie. I turned to leave without a word. If he didn't want to answer me, then I would just have to go and talk to the Alpha King. I could feel Simon's eyes on my back the entire time I walked away.
What aren't you telling me? I asked the Alpha King calmly, why are these humans trying to capture me?
He just stood there and looked at me in surprise, as if shocked that I would dare stand up to him or ask him questions. I don't think I had ever asked him for anything my entire life. Even as a child, I could feel that I was not wanted.
I'm waiting, I said impatiently, trying to ignore as I heard Simon walk up behind me. Olivia's jaw dropped as she stared between our father and me. The king noticed Olivia as well. This is not the time or place to talk about this, Alice, he growled out at me. I need to get Olivia to safety.
Notice that he didn't say to get me to safety as well. No love lost there still.
I see.
He had been decent to me since Simon had stood up for me, but one can only hide their true faces for so long. His words had felt fake anyway.
You aren't getting away from me that easily, I said, and the Alpha King snapped up and stared down at me. Why don't we go to your office, Your Majesty, and we can talk there? Simon interjected, diffusing the situation as he stepped up next to me. The Alpha King looked at Simon for a moment before nodding. Then he bent down and picked Olivia up like a sack of potatoes and jogged off. I wasn't sure if he was trying to get her to safety or get away her from me before I could ask more questions. Simon grabbed my hand before I could object and pulled me back towards the palace grounds. And I looked around as he led, but saw no sign of the attack. That was until we passed the original place we had been standing. The guards were already out, pulling in the dead and injured wolves. With the suddenness of the attack, the group had not managed to kill a single mutant wolf. So it was just the pack wolves they were grabbing. I shuddered as I saw the broken cage that held me for a few minutes. The vehicle and the humans were nowhere in sight, though. Simon squeezed my hand tighter as he saw it as well. But he pulled me on, not letting me stop. When we got inside the grounds, he relaxed a little, but I couldn't. I kept a hold of his hand and dragged him up to the palace, intent on going straight to the Alpha King's office. Then I felt a tug on my hand, stopping me. I whipped around to look at Simon. Why was he stopping me? He did look almost apologetic, but he didn't budge. Perhaps we should go to Joan first and let her know that you are okay, he suggested.
The king is probably still getting Olivia treated anyway. We can speak with him later.
He had a point, not like I would admit that to him, though. So without saying a word, I turned and headed towards the kitchen this time, and was happy that Simon didn't pull my hand back again.
The kitchen door wasn't far away, and as soon as I opened it, I was rushed by Joan. This caused Simon to sadly let go of my hand.
Simon's pop. My heart was still pounding hard as I felt Alice's hand slip from mine and watched her converse with Joan. The fear I had felt when I left the palace and saw the dead bodies was hard to shake.
But it wasn't fear for myself or any of the rest of my students. It was only fear for Alice. If something happened to her, then I didn't know what I would do.
When I had finally found her and she was unharmed for the most part, I nearly kissed her out of relief. But then the surroundings and the anger had reminded me of what was important. Then she hugged me and I nearly forgot all over again. The hug was so sweet, and I found myself missing her touch already as she moved farther away to where the Alpha King had set Olivia down. The moment was ingrained in my brain. After I collected myself, I followed her. It didn't look like Olivia had gotten off as injury-free as Alice, but I couldn't force myself to care. The more I learned about this girl, the more I disliked her. Alice shot me a little glare as I trailed behind her, but that didn't stop me. I knew that Alice was smart and must have realized that I had just lied to her. She had put me on the spot, and I didn't know what to say. Plus, I didn't have all of the information yet either. Alice walked forward and stopped straight in front of the Alpha King, not flinching back at all. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked calmly. "Why are these humans trying to capture me?" The Alpha King glanced over at me, and I gave a quick shake of my head before Alice could notice. I didn't need her knowing that I had already asked him that question myself. It wasn't that I didn't think she could handle the information. I just knew she would have questions, and I wanted to have answers. After the night on the mountain, I spent the next day speaking with the Alpha King. Quite a bit. However, he dodged my questions, telling me that he forbade Alice out of the palace for her own safety. He also reiterated that Alice had nothing to do with mutated wolves, which made me think otherwise at the time. But today we had all seen humans using mutated wolves to attack and try to capture Alice. He couldn't fool me anymore. I had to restart this conversation and get the Alpha King to tell the truth. I couldn't put Alice in danger anymore. I stood there and watched as the Alpha King stumbled over his words for probably the first time in his life. Not sure what to say. "I'm waiting," Alice said impatiently without any fear. I couldn't help but smile in pride at the confident monster that I had created.
This is not the time or place to talk about this, Alice, he growled out. I need to get Olivia to safety.
I noticed that Alice frowned slightly, and the Alpha King didn't even mention her, which should have frustrated her. Once again, I felt the Alpha King's indifference to Alice. This completely overturned his previous statement that Alice was forbidden to leave the palace in order to protect her. I was angry for her. Was she really the daughter of the Alpha King? "You aren't getting away from me that easily," Alice said, when the Alpha King snapped up and stared down at her. "Why don't we go to your office, Your Majesty, and we can talk there?" I interjected, already subconsciously standing beside Alice before he could react. I wanted to protect her. The Alpha King's attitude towards Alice was suspicious. I couldn't trust him not to hurt her. He looked at me for a moment and then, after a moment of assessment, nodded. I took it as a signal that he agreed to talk to me seriously. Then he bent down and picked Olivia up before leaving. I couldn't imagine what it would did like if I came one step late.
Alice could have very well been one of the dead wolves the others were carrying through the palace ground.
The humans didn't seem to want to kill her, but there were always exceptions, and that exception was something I couldn't afford. I watched as Alice tried to console a weeping Joan. I had to talk to the Alpha King right away and get to the truth about her role in all of this. Alice's gaze flickered to me as she hugged Joan. The pain in her eyes ignited my anger.
The humans treated Alice like prey, but she was entirely the opposite. She was a beautiful, energetic girl with a stubborn wildfire spirit, and that was exactly what fascinated me about her.
She should never be in a cage. My hand clenched into a fist. If those humans were still here, I would tear them to shreds. I knew she wanted to know the answer as much as I did, but I had to stop her. I needed to make sure that the answer wouldn't hurt her. I needed to talk to the Alpha King first. If Alice was present, we ran the risk of him not speaking or telling the whole truth, and both of us needed every answer we could possibly get right now. I looked away from her. I was sorry for Alice, but I had to go speak to the Alpha King alone. The fear of almost losing her made it impossible for me to give her over to anyone in the palace. Joan seemed to be the only person I could trust in all of this. Alice believed her, and even though I knew from her reaction to Alice being on the wall the other night that she had more, she wasn't telling us. I felt she was the right person to be with her in times that I couldn't.
Despite my reluctance, I had to leave. If she were by Joan's side, I would worry a little less.
So when Alice wasn't looking, I snuck away and headed for the Alpha King's office.
Chapter 24. Meeting with an Alpha.
Simon's Pub. After leaving Alice, I tentatively made my way to the Alpha King's office. Enough time had passed that he should have Olivia tended to, and I really needed answers not only from him, but from everyone. The humans and mutated rogues were connected, and I had a feeling the Alpha King knew one. I approached the door to his office and took in a deep breath before knocking. Enter, I heard his voice boom through the closed door. I gathered myself before turning the handle and pushing it open.
Your Majesty, I began. You elected to meet with me after managing Olivia's wounds. How is she?
I asked only out of courtesy. I didn't actually care. And he looked up at me from the papers he was holding in his hands. Yes, Simon, please take a seat. She's doing well. Thank you. You really saved the day. I responded only with a nod. It wasn't me, it was Alice, but he'd never admit that. I took a seat in the open chair across from him and pressed forward with the conversation. Sir, I was wondering if you could answer some questions for me concerning Alice. I asked with a level voice. Years and years of experience had taught me how to properly control my emotions. The fear of almost losing her was hitting me harder than I expected. I put my hands into my lap to steady them as I saw them begin to shake at the idea. Alice, what about her? The Alpha King asked in an innocent voice, which I instantly knew was a lie. With all due respect, Your Majesty, you know what I mean? If I'm to put a stop to the mutated rogues, then I need to know the truth. I leaned in closer to him from my seat. This is the second time that those humans have tried to capture Alice now, and it can't be a coincidence. What aren't you telling me? The Alpha King stared at me for a moment and then seemed to break down in front of me. He covered his face in his hands and slouched over in his chair. You have to help me, he exclaimed. I was taken by surprise by his outbursts of emotion. He looked as if he was on the verge of tears, or at least he was trying to be, but still nothing came out. I raised an eyebrow at him and sat back in my seat. Help you with what I asked, playing into his bit. Those humans, he said more calmly and took a deep breath to add to the dramatics. They are from a laboratory that is not far from this pack.
and they are responsible for the mutated rogues. He glanced up at me as if expecting a gasp of surprise or some kind of reaction. I just looked straight at him, encouraging him to continue. I already knew this, but I didn't want to let him in on anything. They're responsible for the missing shifters that have been reported in this area. They take them to use them as bases for their experiments, he continued, and that's where I need your help. They kidnapped my uncle and have been holding him captive for years. I waited for him to say something more, but when he didn't, I interjected. How can I help you? Don't you have guards you could send out? And what does this have to do with Alice? The Alpha King shook his head. They're not as well trained as you, Simon. I hired you because of your skill and knowledge. I believe you can help me rescue my uncle, he explained. I had originally kept Alice to use as leverage in getting my uncle back, but it never worked. They refused to release him.
What I said, feigning surprise. What do you mean that you kept her? I thought she was your daughter.
He was on the cusp of giving me what I needed. I just had to push him a little more.
I just said that to protect her, the Alpha King said defensively, his voice still managing a small broken effect. She's one of them. A mutation of sort.
And there it was. All of my suspicions were officially confirmed, but for some reason, I still found his story odd. He was only staying on the surface level and seemed to be painting himself in a much better light than I was sure was the truth. I had to get him to say more. I needed to get to the bottom of this. Explain, I said simply, waiting to see what else he would come up with. Despite being the Alpha King of this country, I knew he saw me an equal. Since the first moment we met, he had treated me and my ideas with the utmost respect because of our shared class, and in this moment, I knew I could use that to my advantage and push him further than anyone else would dare. Even Alice. The Alpha King sighed after my uncle was abducted. I attempted to rescue him immediately, but was unsuccessful. They were more prepared than I expected of humans. However, during my rescue mission, I ended up saving one of the scientists there, a young pregnant woman, Alice's mother. It was all starting to make sense. Her mother was indeed pregnant before she made it to the pack. The Alpha King continued without my prompting. She seemed so frightened, and I had to bring her back, despite her being a human. I couldn't leave her there. It was for her own safety. But then when Alice was born, we were all shocked. Nobody was prepared. He paused for effect. She came out already mutated and different from anything that any of us had ever seen before in our lives. Unfortunately, Alice's mother's frail human body wasn't able to withstand the labor of giving birth to a supernatural baby, and she died not long after Alice was born. And although Alice seemed like a freak of nature, I knew that she needed to be protected. So I allowed everyone to believe that Alice was mine. I wondered if he seriously thought I was buying the story. It seemed based on a small seed of truth, but I wasn't believing his motives or decisions as he told them. The Alpha King still looked defeated, really trying to sell the fact that he needed my help. It wasn't until the mutated rogues began to appear in the following years of Alice's birth that I realized that they were similar and that Alice wasn't a normal demi-wolf as I had originally suspected. He continued. It was then that I realized that Alice may be extremely important to the humans. Why do you think they want her so badly? I couldn't help but ask. We were finally getting to the part of the story that I wanted to know about. As far as I'm aware, Alice is the only mutated wolf that didn't go insane and seems to have some control over her mutation. He looked up as if contemplating. Maybe it's because she was born as one and not converted. Either way, it made her valuable in terms of their experiment. That part actually made sense. If Alice was a naturally occurring mutation, she was probably the solution to a lot of their studies.
They would at least need to study her blood and see how her genes had developed. She was the original. She was special. You have realized that's what they are, correct? The Alpha King questioned, shaking me from my thoughts.
The mutated rogues. They are all experiments to create abnormally large and powerful shifters by using the blood of my uncle on normal human.
I nodded, and the Alpha King sighed again, this time in relief.
Good. I'm glad you understand. That's why I need you to help me save my uncle for the safety of the shifter world.
I thought that was a little dramatic. We cannot let this human experiment continue or succeed. If they are able to get Alice, they might be able to figure out a way to work out the kinks and create the ultimate army of mutated shifters. Once he had finished telling me his story, I could sense that something was off. Just as I could always sense with Alice, I had a talent for sorting through bullshit and finding the truth. I was worried about a potential army as well, but I didn't believe that was his main concern. So what's the plan? I asked, prodding to find out his real motive. If Alice is what they want, then I think she is our best bet at getting to them. We could use her as bait. There was no way in hell I was actually going to let that happen, but in order to keep him talking, I had to tell him what he wanted to hear. I had to act. We could gather some soldiers, and while you infiltrated to save Alice from the inside, we could attack them from the outside. The Alpha King smiled. Then you could find my dear uncle and notify me of your exact location, so that way I am able to save you. The way he said, your uncle suddenly had me more suspicious. If I had to make a bet at the moment, I would say that his true intentions were to use me and Alice to help destroy the humans and then trap us along with his uncle and allow us to perish with the lab. He definitely wanted to destroy the threat of the human lab, but he didn't want anyone else around. That could be a danger to the position that he held. Too bad he didn't realize that I had no intention of staying here, and hopefully Alice wouldn't either. However, I didn't want to show all of my cards yet, and wanted him to believe that I was still on his side. I still needed his help in taking down the lab, whether I liked it or not. Alan had his few rogues, but they wouldn't be enough to take on a whole base. I contemplated what to do for a moment and then smiled. That plan sounds like it could work. How do we get Alice to agree to being bait? I'll leave that to you, the Alpha King said with a chuckle, and I made another mental note about how quickly his emotions had just changed. So I was to tell Alice, man, she was not going to be happy when she found out. Tom, the Alpha King stood up and walked to the door. Let's begin preparations. The sooner we start, the sooner this can all end. He held the door open, allowing me to stand and walk out first. I waited as he closed the door behind us and then followed him down the hall. When he rounded the corner, I heard footsteps from behind us. I quickly ducked around the corner, knowing exactly who would be not far behind me at the Alpha King's door. It was Alan, and she looked mad. Chapter 25. An unexpected visitor, Simon's pull. There was a light knock on my door. Surprising me, I wasn't expecting anyone, and nobody usually dared to visit me except for Alice. But at this point, she usually just walked in, or it sounded like she would break the door down when she knocked. As far as I knew, she had no idea I had spoken to the Alpha King alone, and I planned on keeping it that way in order to protect her. When I saw her standing outside of the Alpha King's door earlier that evening, I knew that she was pissed. Whether it was at me for breaking my promise to take her there myself or with the king was yet to be determined. Just hoped it wasn't the former. Leaving Alice standing there, knowing the king was inside, was challenging. God knew how much I wanted to tell her everything. However, I needed time to organize my thoughts.
She was so smart that I couldn't let her find out I was hiding something from her until I figured out how to tell her the truth. I walked to the door and cracked it open. My eyebrows raised in surprise as I saw Joan standing outside my door. She stood tall as I looked at her, and I saw a glimmer of Alice's strength and stubbornness. There was no fear in her eyes, which I admired.
May I talk to you, please? She asked, glancing around behind me. Her shiftiness told me that what she wanted to talk to me about must be good because she didn't want anyone to overhear. I stood aside, and she slipped immediately by me and into the room. Hopefully she would tell me more about Alice and how she was faring. I walked over and sat down on the small couch and gestured for Joan to join me. However, she shook her head and began to pace, or at least that's what it looked like to me.
I caught a human from the lab in the palace, Joan suddenly announced. My eyes widened. I was not expecting that. What? Wait, I found them in the kitchen, pretending to be a cook, but I know my kitchen, and I instantly knew something was up. Joan had a severe look in her eyes, and I knew her news would only get worse. I immediately captured him and took him to my room for interrogation. I stood up, then let's go. No, he has already been dispatched, Joan sighed. I couldn't leave him alone to give him a chance to escape, so I already questioned him and got all the information I could. Who was this lady? I initially saw her as a typical chef, but that was obviously not the case. Between having the gun in the forest and interrogating a spy, it was clear that she had a hidden past as well. Why do you not sound enthusiastic about that? I asked, sitting back down cautiously. Apparently, he wasn't the only one. My heart constricted tightly after the humans almost caught Alice on the mountain. The other day, they sent several people to attempt to infiltrate the palace. They are planning on taking Alice out forcibly. How are they getting in? I asked. Nothing was a higher priority than Alice.
The king's protection of Alice has weakened, Joan observed. There used to be guards that would regularly check on her.
And without the maid job, it is harder to keep track of her. Whereabouts? Has he said anything about it to you?
No, I said clearly.
However, I secretly wondered if it was because of me and how close I was with Alice. His protection couldn't have been that strong in the first place if she could sneak out to train with me every night. Maybe it wasn't that his protection had weakened. Maybe it was Alice's need for that protection. She was more skilled and stronger than she once was, which she had proved to me again and again.
I thought about what happened the other night in the woods when we thought Alice had gone. Joan acknowledged. At first it scared me, terrified me. I was worried about how she'd make it out there alone.
But then I realized I had been so overprotective of her that I hadn't noticed how strong she had grown. And she has always had a fierceness about her that nobody has been able to squash.
Why, I asked, why keep her here then? It couldn't have been much better than the alternative.
Joan was quiet for a moment before responding. Based on the other night, it is obvious that you know something of the human lab, Joan said slowly. My eyebrows raised again, and I nodded. Well, Alice's mom was a member of that human lab. At one point, she was one of the scientists working on the experiments. And she was one of my best friends. She ran from the lab, and the humans did anything to get her back. Especially when they found out that she had a child. Apparently, Alice has some abilities that they had previously never seen before. The wolf had assumed that it was a weakness because she is a half-breed. But the humans knew the truth, and they have done everything they can to get to Alice. Joan breathed and sighed, letting her words settle before speaking again. I knew that the wolves here treated her terribly, and that she wished to live in the human world. But I was terrified that if she went, the lab would chase her down.
The wolves might have been awful, but they were a layer of protection I simply could not give her in the human world. I sat there taking in everything she had said. I felt like it was giving me more questions than answers.
If Alice's mom was a scientist, then was Alice herself an experiment? Who was her father? I had already discovered that it wasn't the Alpha King.
Joan stood there waiting for my reaction. I rubbed my temples. It was a lot, but I knew where I stood.
It doesn't matter where Alice came from, I began. She is a wolf, and I will treat her as such.
Joan looked satisfied with my answer and notably calmed down. She even managed to walk over and sit on the couch beside me.
You know, I've noticed the most change in her since you arrived, Joan said, with a small smile. I believe that because of you, Alice no longer rejects her shifter status. She trusts you, and it seems like you make her happy.
I stared at her, trying to think of what to say. Her words surprised me, and I knew that she was like a mother to Alice.
I wondered if she would scold me for our closeness. Not very many people would be okay with our age gap.
As if reading my mind, Joan began talking again. I don't care about your age or your past.
All I care about is if you care about her and that you can keep her safe. If she chooses to stay in the shifter world, I must know you can protect her.
After this conversation, do you really still think that Alice is a weakling? I asked. Joan was silent. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, so I continued. You have always protected.
But Alice is smart, and she has her own power. Please help her to find her strength and let her gain confidence. She will benefit more from that than me, just blindly protecting her.
Now it was her turn to raise her eyebrows. It was obvious that my words had surprised her.
She stared out the window, and we sat silently for a few minutes before she spoke again.
You remind me of Alice's mom and myself. She said, you know, I was a soldier too. Once upon a time, I dreamed of making it a full career, and Alice's mom was a doctor, a gentle and strong woman. Maybe that's why Alice likes you so much.
Alice likes me. I choked out, trying to keep my voice as calm and natural as possible.
I obviously failed miserably because Joan smiled knowingly at me. You two need to figure out your relationship, she said, putting her hands up in a gesture universally known as "don't involve me." She's just extremely hard to read sometimes, I said, still trying to get her insight or advice. If I was interested, would she even be open to me? I don't ever do this and do not have good luck with it. What would be your advice? I mean, if I was interested.
Joan laughed. It was loving and tender, and I blushed. I will give you a little advice just because I can tell you youngins need it.
Joan's eyes looked serious now. First, if Alice didn't like you, you would know. If you want to know her true feelings, then just ask her. I have never seen her be as honest with anyone as she is with you. And second, make sure you return her honesty with your own. Alice has difficulty trusting people, so trust is a huge thing for her. Okay, I said, nodding my head. I'll tell you one more thing, too. Joan rolled her eyes, obviously harmed by my inexperience.
I know you like her, but she doesn't know that she is not used to kindness and doesn't understand what it is if someone actually likes her. Many male wolves have tried to sleep with her because she is a beautiful girl, but nobody has actually tried to love her. She does not understand what love is, so you will have to explain it to her. You can't be subtle with her, or she will most likely misunderstand you.
I stared at her in surprise. I had never expected this old chef to be so blunt with me. For the first time since childhood, I felt my body warm at her words. But instead of being embarrassed, I was more excited to hear the advice. She must really think that Alice actually liked me, and that made me ecstatic. Joan knew Alice better than anyone. I better get back to work before someone misses me, Joan noted as she walked to the door.
She paused before opening it. Thank you for reminding me that Alice is a strong and independent woman, not a weak and helpless little girl anymore. You have put my heart at rest.
She turned to leave when I wanted to call out to her.
Wait, I shouted, since Alice's mother was a lab member, does she have anything left to solve Alice's dilemma? I asked.
No wonder Alice likes you, Mr. Simon. You are sharp, I smiled in response. Joan reciprocated it and then nodded.
Alice's mother did leave behind something that could help her. It was information on how to destroy the lab and solve the flawed mutated wolf gene once and for all. She stopped and bit her lip, seemingly not knowing how to continue.
What about Alice? I asked nervously. Alice will be fine, she finally stated. The lab is what's important. Important. I started, surprised at hearing her say such things. She can't shift and doesn't have a wolf. You don't see that as a problem.
That's different, Joan said, closing the door again, but not letting go of the handle.
I'm just telling you what her mother left. I'm not a scientist, and I can't explain how it works.
I opened my mouth to speak, but Joan beat me to it.
Alice's mother told me that she was okay. She had the utmost faith in her daughter, believing she could use her abilities to help humans turn into powerful shifters rather than their aggressive counterparts. I have to believe in that too. My eyes widened and my mouth opened unconsciously, but I didn't know what to say.
What she said was incredible. Turn humans into powerful werewolves. I knew that the human lab was doing experiments like this, but as far as I knew, they all failed. It was where the mutant rogues came from. However, I also knew that Alice was special, but the idea that she and she alone could rectify this error didn't cease to amaze me. No wonder the people in the lab didn't give up on getting to her. Joan sighed, bringing me back to reality. Alice's mother had anticipated this situation, so she left behind books for her. I gave them to her at a young age so she could study botany and learn how to protect herself. She raised her eyebrows at me and smirked, which I hear you've learned about firsthand. I remembered the time when Alice made my face covered with acne. She later told me that it was because she used some kind of herb. So that was how she knew what to do, the book. But rather than thinking fondly of the memory, it only angered me. Her mother expected Alice to carry this burden alone. The thought made my blood boil. You of all people should know that her mother's wish is near impossible. Alice did not grow up in the human world, and she was not systematically trained. How is there any possible way that she could learn enough about the technology needed to fight against the laboratory? I heard my voice rising, but I couldn't stop it. I clenched the couch cushion for support. Calm down, Mr. Simon, Joan said softly. I understand that it's difficult to hear. I reacted the same as you at one point, but Alice's mom had no choice. She needed someone to stop the lab experiment. She tried herself, but without success. There is no doubt that she loved Alice, but she is in the same amount of, if not more, danger now as she would be fighting against them. According to the humans, Alice should have become the perfect artificial werewolf, a result of 2 successful experiments. Despite her inability to fully shift, the lab will give up on hunting her. There was a long silence after Joan stopped speaking. I thought about what she had said and slowly let go of the couch. None of this has anything to do with Alice, I stated, shaking my head. She has suffered for too long and deserves revenge on those who have done her and her parents wrong. You have shown her a lot of beauty in the human world, but that's only part of it. Does she know about any of that? Joan shook her head sadly, confirming my gut instinct. Alice had no idea. She would be destroyed once she found out. Then my thoughts caught me off guard. A situation like this, and the first thing on my mind was her. I was hopelessly falling in love, and there was no stopping it. I nodded at Joan, my future clearly laid out before me. All right, we should keep it that way.
I have experience with combat. I can handle this, all of it. Now tell me, what methods did Alice's mother leave behind to destroy the lab?